It's in the very early days of the crisis, and has a long way to go until it reaches its peak. It believes it will reach its peak the first week of May. But some of the very interesting things that they've done as a city is, first of all, completely reorganize the organization so that they now focus on having a crisis management unit. They've deployed resources to be able to deal with the crisis. They've doubled their ICU capacity. They've also recognized who are their most vulnerable communities in the city of Buenos Aires. And for them, it's people living in informal settlements. Other cities, it's people living in deprived neighborhoods, but for them, it's in informal settlements. And they've taken some strong initiatives, like, for example, one of the things that they did is they recognized the difficulties in protecting intergenerational households in Italy. So one of the things that they've actually done is, for those kinds of households, they're offering people who are over the age of 65 that they can isolate them in a hotel which the city will cover. And that's in addition to those Argentinian citizens who are coming from abroad and are required to be quarantined for a period of 14 days. So I think this is definitely a first, and a lot of other cities in the global south are looking at this effort to see if it's something that they could follow. I guess business has been incredibly useful in terms of trying to provide some of the support for homeless populations as well. One of the things that they face, like many other cities, is they also have to feed vulnerable populations. And that's something that New York is experiencing on an exponential rate as well. So I guess they have noticed that there's a high level of solidarity. What they are thinking about is how they can maintain that into the future. They've found that their digital education system has worked extremely well. And despite their limited infrastructure, they have 57,000 users per day, with 800 teachers providing online services. Post-lockdown, they think that that may be required to continue for some time. And I guess one of the things that they're starting to think about is their switch-on strategy. And they've been very much working with other cities around the world to think about what the switch-on strategy could look like. So the next city I'm going to talk about is the best example that I've came across in the world that's actually thinking about their switch-on strategy. So first of all, you know, they have a population in the city of Melbourne of around 5 million people, but they actually have a very low number of cases. And only 75 of their actual cases are locally transmitted cases. The majority are from travel. So what they would say is that very early lockdown, comprehensive testing has resulted in very low levels of transmission at the community level. The response, of course, has been medical, and they have had a resilient strategy in place for a very long time in their city, and they were immediately able to activate it. They've done a lot of the standard things in terms of providing financial support, providing accommodation for homeless, people feeding the homeless, and so on. But the other thing that they've done is a massive cleanup program of the city. They've really focused on cleaning every aspect of public infrastructure, and will continue to do so in the coming months. One of the things that they are starting to think about as well is the big loss of city revenue that will result because of this crisis. And they are working with their fellow cities around the world to think about alternative ways of generating revenue as a city. So, you know, how they can find alternative ways of taxing people, recognizing that they're going to be in a very constrained economic environment. They have already prepared a draft model which they've shared, and in fact, I will stop sharing the screen and show you just some thoughts that they have already that they've been sharing with cities around the world of some of the emerging trends and how they're focusing on developing a strategy to post-COVID-19 to respond to the changing environment that we find ourselves in. So I will share just an alternative document with you, which is this is a very long document, and I'll just show you a small portion of it. But one piece of work that they've done is they've started to look at the emerging trends that are resulting because of COVID-19. And for example, they're seeing reduced data privacy for citizens. So for example, facial recognition technology was largely used in Chinese cities to avail of services before this crisis, particularly to purchase bus tickets, train tickets, etc. And you know, now that facial recognition technology has been used to trace contacts, to monitor the health of populations. And I guess there's concerns from Melbourne City's perspective on how this stands versus data privacy for citizens. Before this crisis, China was accused of certain human rights violations because of this use of facial recognition technology. So Melbourne is already thinking about how they would deal with this. The other piece that they're seeing is local decentralized systems and networks are growing. So again, they're thinking about how they can respond as a city. They are witnessing a huge increase in cyber attacks. And they're noticing that city infrastructure is vulnerable to this, including health infrastructure. So they're starting to think about how they can prepare to withstand that. They're also seeing that hotels are being used to house homeless people. And they actually see this situation panning out for quite some time into the future. So again, they're thinking about how they accommodate their homeless and vulnerable populations, not just during this crisis, but after this crisis, so that they're resilient to such crises. They're also seeing that there's a big strain on digital infrastructure. So, the rise and rise of digital infrastructure, classes are online, etc. We're currently, talking to each other via Zoom. So they will need to provide their infrastructure upgrades to meet the demand for digital infrastructure. I guess the other thing they're saying is the rise of 3D printing. So how they as a city can respond and be prepared for 3D printing is something they're focusing on. They're seeing automation being used to a much greater extent. In Hong Kong, robots are being used to disinfect trains. We're seeing the use of drones in emergency situations. So again, as a city, they're thinking about what they need to do to respond. They're seeing a rapid deployment to remote working. So they're asking themselves, how does this change the future of real estate within their city, including, for example, not just commercial offices and so on, but schools. They are seeing the shift towards virtual cultural experiences. So again, as a city, they're thinking about how they need to provide cultural experiences virtually. They're also seeing an open innovation, a flourishing of open innovation. And again, they're thinking about how they can accommodate it. They had a big focus before on the circular economy in the city, but they're seeing disposables becoming more front and center. So they're trying to think about how they can retain this focus on the circular economy, yet ensuring public health requirements. They're also seeing a rapid move towards sustainable mobility, particularly walking and cycling. One of the things that they're thinking about is how do they widen their footpaths to ensure social distancing as people walk? How do they give over more of their road space to cycling? They recognize that there will be an infrastructure stimulus required post-COVID-19, and this is actually a relatively low-cost option that they can pursue. They're also recognizing the impact that isolation has on mental health, and they expect that post-lockdown, there will also be a considerable impact on mental health, and they're thinking about how they can respond to that. They're seeing delivery services growing and growing, and they expect that to continue. They're seeing the move towards a cashless society, and again, particularly until a vaccine is found, that will need to continue, albeit they think that that will continue into the future. They're seeing that businesses are refocusing on their immediate needs rather than their long-term needs. One of the concerns that they have is that businesses were very focused on addressing climate change, for example, in the city of Melbourne before this, and they're seeing that focus change. So again, that's something that they're giving thought to. So they're all the emerging trends that they as a city are seeing. So what they're doing is trying to look at what an alternative landscape looks like for their city. And they've essentially mapped out two models, a react and return and a transform and adopt model. And what they have been doing is mapping out for each and every aspect of those emerging trends, what it would mean for politics and governments, what it would mean for the economy and finance, what it would mean for philosophy, what it would mean for the environment, what it would mean for scientific and technological advancement, what it would mean for the creative industries, what it would mean for social and community. And they're mapping that out according to two scenarios. So I think it's really good practice, and certainly they are the front runner, and a lot of cities that we work with are very much following the lead of Melbourne in terms of trying to think about what the future looks like in a post-COVID-19 scenario, and indeed living with COVID-19. So I'm going to go back to what I was originally sharing with you, just some of the other practices of cities very, very briefly. Turning to Japan, I'm going to principally just call out things that are different here. Japan has a very long culture of disaster preparedness, so they are much better prepared than other cities in other parts of the world to deal with this scenario. That includes immediate communication with all citizens about the onset, for example, the potential of a tsunami, the potential of an earthquake, and so they're much better equipped to be able to deal with this situation. They do not have currently legislation in place that allows for a lockdown. But what they have is a very good, as I say, preparedness process in place. One of the things they have been doing is stockpiling PPE for a very long time. So they're not facing, in the cities, so they're not facing the same crisis that other cities are facing in terms of personal protection equipment. They are following a lot of the other standard models in terms of, testing, contact tracing, utilizing hotels. But another thing that they have in their favor is they have the highest level of hospital beds per thousand of population in the OECD. So they have 13 beds per thousand of population. If you compare that, for example, to somewhere like the UK, they have 2. So they have the medical infrastructure in place already. So I think if I turn to Finland, what Helsinki has in common with Fukuoka in Japan, and by the way, I picked Fukuoka because it tends to be the most innovative city in Japan, what they both have in common is preparedness. Again, in Finland, they stockpiled PPE for a long period of time. So yes, they will have difficulties in the long run with PPE, but they don't have those immediate concerns that many other cities have. In fact, the biggest concern that the mayor of Helsinki would refer to is social consequences associated with COVID-19. So they're very lucky to have a mayor that is a former, he's a lawyer, he's a former ECB senior executive, EIB, I should say, senior executive. He's also a former minister for housing and was heavily involved in solving the homelessness crisis in Finland over a long period of time. So there's immense experience there. Also, what's unique about the Helsinki situation is the mayor is responsible for the delivery of every type of infrastructure, including health infrastructure, apart from policing. So they have control over the hospitals in the city of Helsinki. As a result, the mayor has an operations group that collects data, creates scenarios, and prepares decisions for the city on that basis. The city is also locked down from the rest of the country in that most of the cases in the country is in the city of Helsinki. They've also been giving rent-free periods, for example, to tenants that are in any council properties to see them over the worst of this crisis. And those tenants would primarily be startups and small businesses. So they're trying to make sure that they get a break. I guess another piece that they're very focused on is making sure that those who are in vulnerable positions or isolated from society don't become more isolated, and there's a large movement. They've deployed a lot of City Hall resources to make sure they're looking after those people. They're very concerned post-lockdown about their creative economies, their tourism sector, their events sector, and their startup community, and most of their stimulus will focus on that as well. The city of Amsterdam, I guess, they have quite a different approach. They call it intelligent lockdown, but other people would call it madness in terms of the Dutch approach, and they recognize that others don't necessarily agree with their approach. Their peak is very much now. They have intensified, increased, I should say, the number of ICU beds. They've done a lot of similar things that other cities have done, but some of the things that are worthy of note, they have noticed, for example, that a lot of citizens are gathering and not observing social distancing in parks. So one of the things they're looking at is that people will need to reserve space in parks to actually go to parks. So they are also very concerned about the post-lockdown scenario, and particularly the impact on their cultural sector and their tourism sector. And they're working actively with Melbourne to start to think through their post-lockdown scenario. Another thing they have done, by the way, is they have given 1,000 refurbished laptops to allow internet connectivity for people in vulnerable households so that children can continue with their education, etc., online. The City of New York. The City of New York is the first to say they are in the eye of the storm. I speak to them on a daily basis. The situation gets worse with each given day. I think one of the most stark things that they're trying to deal with is they're trying to feed 1.1 million people every day. So in the City of New York, they recognize that the minute they close schools and creches, that they would need to feed vulnerable populations, vulnerable children. But what they've actually experienced is they first started to focus on feeding children, but actually the food was being taken by their families. So they then had to move to feed families because so many people are actually losing their jobs. They've had to triple their hospital capacity. One of the unique things that they've had to do, and one of the benefits of having an International Affairs Commissioner in New York, has been that they've been able to call upon the international community for help. That included the United Nations providing them with vital personal protection equipment, and many countries and cities around the world have sent them donations. So I think that has really shown its benefits. They've been working a lot with us in the forum in terms of connecting with wider business to avail of ventilators and vital medical equipment. One of the things that they're very, very focused on at the moment is trying to get people to complete the census so that they get a better understanding of their infrastructural need and they can start to think about what they need in the future. So what I wanted to talk to you after New York was just, let's look quickly at China in terms of what does post-lockdown look like in China before we can just think what cities need to think about in the longer term in the Irish context. So post-lockdown in China, there's a number of measures. The first thing is a 14-day lockdown for anyone returning to the city. So we know that the Chinese New Year was happening when lockdown was declared in China, so many people found themselves in a different place other than the place that they lived. So when these people have returned to the city, there's a mandatory 14-day lockdown. The other thing that they've introduced, and this is coming back to data concerns, is they have a health QR code system. So the health QR code system means that citizens are required to provide information on their travel history, their temperature, for example, if they've been interacted with anybody who has tested positive for COVID-19. And this is checked, this QR code is checked before they enter any public building, a supermarket, a bank, a post office, also trains, for example, subway systems, buses. So only if you have a green QR code system can you travel. So they leverage big data and scan mobile usage data to indicate the locations you've been in, to understand your health and well-being, the tickets that you've booked, etc. And this ultimately comes up with a QR code reading. If you have interacted with somebody in the last 14 days who has now, for example, tested positive for COVID-19, your green status will change immediately. The other thing that they're doing is they're wearing masks. And in many cases in offices, they're wearing goggles as well. They are observing social distancing. There's flexible commuter patterns. So for example, in Beijing, they've actually postponed the license plate restrictions, which restricted the number of cars that could go into the city. They've also introduced temperature control. For example, in Beijing, 106 subway stations have artificial intelligence enabled body temperature detection systems. They have the subway app system can tell people in real time how crowded the subway is, so you know whether you can get on the subway or not. They've also launched customized bus route booking systems through the city authority, which is connecting people directly from their communities to their place of employment. The other thing they've done is introduce flexible work schedules. So, people start at different times, and the city has recommended that offices work at 50% of their capacity. And there's been specific recommendations issued by the city authority in that regard. Also, what they have found is that business travelers are not using planes. They're opting for high-speed rail. And they have restricted the number of tickets that can be sold on these trains to just 50%. Schools have yet to reopen. They've found that remote schooling has been very successful. The final thing, just before I finish up, some of the big things that are likely to change in cities as a result of COVID-19. I think there's going to be a very big focus on an infrastructure stimulus. There's going to be a post-mortem in terms of outcomes. I mentioned earlier on that in Japan, they have 13 hospital beds per 1,000 of population. In the UK, they have 2. When we look at ICU beds in Europe, in Germany, they have 29 per 100,000 of population. In Italy, they have 12. In Ireland, they have less than 6. In the UK, they have less than 6. That is going to have an impact on outcomes, and ultimately questions will be asked. So there will be a major demand for equality in terms of the provision of hospital infrastructure per 1,000 of population. Also, I mentioned earlier this huge advance in digital infrastructure. The cholera outbreak in the 19th century in London resulted in water and sanitation being deployed en masse. We could see digital infrastructure as being the legacy of COVID-19. In terms of mobility, walking and cycling is definitely going to be a major way forward. We do not want people, being put into cars, more people in cars, because we know this is a respiratory pathogen, and the last thing we want is reduced air quality. So also trains, to get people back on trains, they need to ensure social distancing, and the same with buses. Well buildings and communities. Already the International Well Building Institute has had a major focus on creating buildings and communities and cities that embrace wellness in terms of good physical and good mental health. I think that that's going to become even greater than ever. Certainly at the World Economic Forum, we've had a drive for net zero carbon buildings and cities for a long time, and we've really made the case that there's an added co-benefit in terms of delivering well buildings. And those will need to be coupled. Affordable housing. We are going to see a lot of foreclosures. A lot of people are going to lose their jobs. So the demand for affordable housing will be greater than ever. We're also seeing the worst of this already playing out. Yesterday, I was on a call with the city of Lagos, the city of Accra, 2 cities with enormous informal settlements. People are starving in these informal settlements. It's impossible to lock down communities where people are daily wage earners and in that scenario cannot eat, but also cannot observe social distancing. So in the global south, this is going to become demanded to a much greater extent. I guess there's also going to be a huge debate around density. What represents good density? So in the UK already, they're arguing our outcomes are worse because of density. However, contrast that to Hong Kong, and that's not the case. So I think there will have to be careful arguments about that. The future of work is here. We are going to work from home more. So real estate in our cities is going to be much more about check-in infrastructure. The other thing we are going to demand is emergency preparedness of cities. So that personal protection equipment, supply chains are protected, that food systems are protected. And I think we will see a lot more of the maker city mentality, where a lot more is made closer to home. So I'm going to leave it there. I wanted to try and give you an overview of what some cities in different parts of the world are thinking, as well as how lockdown is ending in China, and finally, some of the things that we believe will change. Thank you very much.
Alice, that was absolutely fantastic. Thank you very much for those remarks. The breadth of the work that you have done is extraordinary, and I'm really pleased to see that last slide in particular. One of the things that's just really impressed me over the last couple of weeks is how fast everything has changed, how much things have moved. And I was particularly struck by your reference to the cholera outbreak. I think that we will see these things changing in the next while. We've got lots of questions coming in from our many people online. Just a reminder to every participant, if you want, you just send me a private chat and I'll put the questions to the speakers at the end. Moving on to Catriona Cahill. Dr. Cahill, if you're ready for your remarks, please take the screen and tell us what you think.
Okay, so hi everybody. So what I'm just basically going to touch upon is supporting businesses after the lockdown. I think it's fair to say that over the years we've seen an increasing level of interdependence between businesses and city regions. So in terms of supporting businesses after lockdown, we can look at this in the short term, but we can also look at it in the medium to long term. To be honest, in the short term, the supports that we identify, they're fairly straightforward, because what we're seeing is that it's been concentrated in particular sectors like retail, hospitality, leisure, and they all have a strong presence in almost every city centre. So the negative impact on city centres in particular could end up being quite severe if we don't see certain supports implemented to help those sectors in particular. I think then in the medium to long term, it becomes a bit more complex, because what we're going to have to see is a very targeted response that will vary across the different city regions. And I think in an Irish context, a lot of our policies stems from a national or a regional context. And I think unless we see certain changes come about in the future, it actually limits the response that cities themselves can have to crisis. So we'll just go through. I won't labour too long on the short-term aspects, because I want to focus more on the medium to long term. But when we think about the businesses aspects and where the support needs to go, like I said, all city centres now are going to experience the exact same things across retail and hospitality. We have businesses that are essential and non-essential. The essential businesses aren't going to be impacted. If anything, they've seen a demand increase for some of their products. When you look at the non-essential grouping, then we have those businesses that I would consider to be vulnerable and those that I would consider to be very vulnerable. So the vulnerable businesses are those that have been able to implement some level of remote working practice. So they're still seeing some revenue coming in the Irish context with the aid of the temporary wage subsidy scheme. They're probably able to meet the majority of their costs. And you probably see companies like financial services company, legal firms fall within this grouping. But then you have the very vulnerable businesses, which are the ones that have had to close. They haven't been able to implement remote working practices. And they're very much concentrated in non-essential retail, hospitality and leisure. So when we see the lockdown end, and it will be a phased reduction, we don't know what that's going to look like yet, but outside of what it will look like, there's going to have to be certain supports that are introduced in tandem with that phasing of the lockdown. Now, with regards to the goal of this, it's cash flow. Cash flow is everything here. And I think it's clear to see from the three elements that I've up on the screen here on what we can focus on in short term, grants, compensation, loans, taxation. You immediately think of this in the macro context, and you start to realise exactly how limited cities are with regards to being able to respond to help businesses in the short term. So just on grants and compensation, if we think about the businesses that have had to close, even though they've had no revenue income for over 2 months by the time the lockdown ends, what we have is a situation where their debt in terms of their fixed costs has only really been deferred, and they're going to come back effectively to accumulated debt. Now, some countries have recognised the stress of this on particular micro and small businesses. So, for example, Denmark has introduced a subsidy support scheme to cover a certain percentage of small businesses' fixed costs, rents and utilities. And Germany has gone another route where they've given a direct grant for businesses with employees of less than 10, where they get a maximum grant of 15,000, and they can use that money to pay their fixed costs. In an Irish context, what we've seen introduced in terms of grants, and these grants are being delivered at the local level through the local enterprise office. We've had one grant to promote moving your business to online, and one that you can use for external consultancy fees in order to get somebody in to help you with a business plan. Now, there might be some merit in the medium to long term for moving your business to online. but it's not the support that's needed now in the immediate sense. So what we really need to be seeing is at the local level, because it's clear that we can deliver grants at the local level, they need to be targeted to the support that's needed right now along working capital and addressing fixed costs. The loan aspect is very macro. We're very limited in what can be done at a city level, but I think it's worth noting that what's been introduced today from micro and small businesses, it's not going to be effective, because small businesses in times of uncertainty, they're risk averse. They don't want to take out loans. What's available now for micro businesses, they get 6 months free from repayments and a 0 interest rate. But after the 6 months, the interest rate actually goes back up to 4.5% if you apply through your local enterprise office, and 5.5% if you apply just directly to the scheme itself. For SMEs, they can only access loans at a rate of an interest rate of 4%. So when you think about the fact that as a country, we took in 750 million euros yesterday with a negative yield of 0.25%, there's no justification for having interest rates as high as between 4 and 5%. To incentivize those companies to use loans to support them for working capital, it needs to be more attractive, and that means 0% interest rates over the term of the loan. On taxation, really the only way we can look at this at a city level or local authority level, commercial rates would fall under this. So up to now, all that's been given for businesses is a deferral on commercial rates for 3 months. That's not going to be enough, because like I said, many of these businesses will have closed, will have no revenue having come in. The UK response to this has been to waive the commercial rates for a year. Now I want to talk about commercial rates just in a few minutes as well in relation to the city aspect, but that's certainly something that's going to have to be looked at. Taxation otherwise is very much governed at the national level, but there's ways in which the government can be innovative on this front. Like, we've all heard the general discussion of we need to reduce tourism and hospitality VAT rate back to 9%. We need to give waivers on PSRI returns for a particular length of time. But other countries like Italy, for example, introduce a 50% tax credit to help with sanitation costs. And I think that's something that's going to be an issue for Irish businesses as well, because even though we might come out of the lockdown, businesses will be expected to abide for an extended period of time by the HSE rules and regulations. So there's going to be a cost burden on them for that. So I think that's something that has to be recognised and acknowledged as well. So just to kind of go on to medium and a long-term focus. So I think in times of crisis, the impact of a shock, what it kind of serves to do is exacerbate kind of underlying issues that are already present. And I think that we can see these issues now at all different levels, so national, regional, and the city level. So I think at national level, and this very much feeds into the debate that's going on at the moment about, in the post-crisis period, will there be an extension of the state? And really, where I think we can look at two protection gaps is one with regards to the fact that we don't really, or we failed as a country, I think, to recognise the importance of the link between the employer and the employees. So in other countries like Germany, they had a short-time working scheme that had been implemented for several decades. But what they were able to do during times of crisis was they were able to make slight tweaks, and they did it again for COVID. Now, that has been credited for Germany having recovered so quickly from the 2008 crisis. What we had in the Irish case was that we saw a temporary subsidy scheme introduced. We actually have a short-time working scheme, but obviously it wasn't fit for purpose in terms of what we needed to happen. So I think that if we see this temporary wage subsidy scheme come to an end after 12 weeks, there might be an extension maybe for some companies that are particularly at risk. We don't know yet, we haven't got details on that. But I think it would be remiss of us to completely forget about the importance then of the link once again between the employer and the employee. We need to have more of a permanent protection mechanism in place that is there behind the scenes and that is triggered during crisis times, which is exactly like we see in Germany. I think where the other protection gap has shown up for businesses is around insurance. So a lot of the businesses felt that they would be okay with covering their fixed costs during the crisis period because they thought they were covered under business continuity insurance. And then they read the fine print and they realized that they had excluded pandemics from this. Now, you can understand why insurance companies would shy away from providing coverage during pandemics, because they're all about diversifying risk, and you can't diversify away from a pandemic. But where we've seen kind of similar issues with the provision of insurance arise around catastrophes or natural disasters, terrorist attacks, we've started to see partnerships form between the public and the private sectors. So we've seen this in Spain, we've seen it in France, and really it's the private sector remains front of house because they've accumulated decades of experience on the insurance front, and then the government acts as a reinsurer behind the scenes. And what that does is that it makes sure that this protection is provided at affordable prices, which is the key thing, because that couldn't happen without the government's intervention. So I think, you know, it's been identified for a while that insurance costs are a big issue for SMEs, and there have been several political parties that have made a commitment to review this in the future. So I think they also need to start considering a pandemic, because if we have a situation now where a lot of experts are saying that pandemics and viruses could be the norm for us over time, you know, we have to start addressing that protection gap that's there. At the regional level, I think a clear thing is disparities. Balanced regional development is a big issue for Ireland, not just Ireland, other countries as well. And I think that the last crisis, it's fair to say, had a negative impact on regional disparities. So you kind of look at this in two senses. You can look at it in terms of Dublin's growth versus other regions' growth, or you can look at it in terms of how quickly a city recovers in comparison to how quickly rural areas recover. And I'm concerned that after this crisis, we'll see those disparities start to worsen again unless the government starts to target the policy towards the particular regions. So to do that, they have to identify what factors make one region or city region more resilient than another region. And they have to start preparing in that sense, because Project Ireland 2040 was implemented to promote balanced regional development. But there's a lot of criticism around the investment plan that accompanied that. And I think that, you know, to date, it's been very piecemeal. It's been very kind of something, a bit of something for everybody. And I know that there's obviously political agenda that comes behind that. But I think now we need to start making a firm commitment that investment needs to go into the city region, so that then there can be positive knock-on benefits to other areas. But then if we break it down then to the city level, I think where the key problems that are showing up are centered around is both in the governance and in the funding. So from the majority of local authorities, over a third of their revenue actually comes from commercial rates. And that's all obviously something that I flagged in the previous slide as being a big cost burden for businesses, and a lot of businesses are going to struggle to pay that in the next while. Now, in the sense of COVID-19, I think that this funding gap will have to be plugged by the central government. I don't think it's fair to expect the local authorities to plug that. But over time, I think it will be necessary for the local government to look at their revenue streams, because outside of COVID-19, we have to understand how our industries are evolving, and retail is changing significantly. You know, only a third of Irish SMEs actually take orders online, and 75% of all orders that come from Irish customers are to companies outside of Ireland that have no premises in Ireland. So there's a lot of market that can be recaptured there for Irish retailers. So I think in the medium term, you will see a lot of policy geared towards bringing businesses online. And so I think the dependency on the commercial rates needs to change. And that's outside of the whole argument around how they're currently calculated and the connection between the rates and rents, which probably isn't the most efficient way to calculate that. If you think about the other streams as well, like for example, local authorities depend on parking charges, and they depend on parking fines and income from that. And that completely goes against the goal of promoting the city to look towards public transport and sustainable modes of transport like walking and cycling. So I think that's certainly something that's going to have to be reviewed after this. We'll probably have to go a step further as well and focus more attention on local government reform. Because if you think of the interplay between businesses and a city and what drives that, it kind of falls under three different elements. So the first one is density, second one is generally assets, and the third is generally institutions. So for the institutions in an Irish context, we kind of tick that box because we're fortunate with that. Our 5 main cities, we have either a very, very good university or very good institute of technology on our doorstep. If we think about the density element though, I don't think, I'll use Limerick as an example, I don't think we tick that box because particularly within the core of the city, what we have is a large Georgian area that's not fit for purpose for a lot of residential and commercial uses now as industries are evolving, and it's very costly to renovate this aspect. So I think we do struggle with the density element within not just Limerick but other cities as well. And the other one, asset, that generally focuses on public transport, and we have very poor service levels of public transport, particularly bus services in our cities. And it's my concern that this is going to worsen after this crisis, because what we have seen over time as well is that these state-owned enterprises like Bus Éireann will have a public service obligation that they've had to continue to deliver services, even though it's reduced in frequency, for passengers where the drop has been maybe between 80 and 90%. We already have a historical underfunding of the PSO services for buses. So that's something I think we're going to see the bus service element get worse before it gets better, unless the government steps in to address that. And I think you have to look at the aspect as well in terms of the control that local authority has over these things. They might have large responsibility with the delivery of the infrastructure and the bus corridors, but they have very little say over regards to the service that's then put on those corridors. So I think that's kind of elements that are going to have to be looked at in the future if we want to promote that interplay between businesses and city regions. So just to finish up, I think that COVID-19, it's providing us with an opportunity to not just, I suppose, rebound and go back to the status quo, but to rebound and be better. And I think that the only way that can be achieved is if there is more of a targeted policy response from government in the medium to long term. So I'll just finish up there.
Very good. Thank you very much, Catriona. I particularly liked the way that you linked the regional, the local, and the national levels to their policy gaps. And there's lots of questions coming in about that we will get to in the next session. So can I turn then to Philip for your remarks, and then we'll get to the questions. Again, a reminder, just to send me a private message with your question, and then I will, if we have time, read it out to the participants. Thank you. So take it away, Philip.
Okay, you can hear me now, I think. Okay, so I think just in terms of my thoughts about this, what I want to try and do is kind of connect it into a kind of a few general ideas that I look at in terms of my research. And so if I was to try and summarize what I do, I'm interested in the interface between social economic dynamics and urban change, but over quite a long period of time. And so one of the things that I'm very interested in is the idea of policy mobilities, and so where policies come from and how they kind of become embedded within different places over time. And I think just to pick up on what Alice was talking about, it's quite interesting to see that kind of question of the extent to which Irish cities or groups within Irish cities actually engage with other places. And one of the things I'll come back to kind of later on is some of our limitations from a governance perspective in Ireland, the extent to which we actually have a very weak governance structure at the city level. So that's quite striking, I think. I'm also cautious, I think, and this is something that's going on in terms of debates within geography at the moment, not just within urban geography, but more generally about making comments on the COVID-19 crisis too quickly. And so what I want to try and do is kind of connect this in with some of the kind of longer term sort of thinking or longer term kind of questioning over cities. I'm going to start with a quick quote. I've been looking a little bit over the last little while at the question of the modernist city, and then also the kind of the shift from the modernist city to the kind of more kind of, I suppose, contemporary approach that we've seen from, you know, what is now nearly 50 years or so, but emerging in the 1960s, then becoming kind of more predominant in the 70s and 80s, and the kind of the back to the city kind of movement that has become kind of stronger and stronger over the years. And within that, we see kind of what I sort of summarize as a kind of a tendency for kind of modernist bashing. And so, you know, the kind of the bête noire, I suppose, is Le Corbusier and his desire to kind of to remove significant parts of historical Paris. I'm not trying to defend that, but it's just to kind of point to kind of some of the stuff that maybe is being highlighted at the moment around how we can understand particular movements, particular moments as they emerge within time. And so I wrote a piece recently that was looking at and critiquing some of the ideals within Richard Sennett's Keto papers. And so this piece of work, I won't go into detail about what it's about, but essentially it's looking at and trying to, in essence, kind of place the blame for a lot of our general urban problems at the feet of Le Corbusier's Charter of Athens from 1933. And so I kind of take this on and look at and try to tease out some of the ideas within modernism in kind of a more sort of subtle manner. And so there's a kind of there's a quote from CIM as a group. So it's a Congress of Modern Architecture. I won't try and pronounce the French term, but it's the International Congress of Modern Architecture, emerging in kind of the 1920s, 1930s, and going up into the late 1950s. And so essentially they had various different congresses over time, the most famous being CIM4, from which the Charter of Athens emerges. But in kind of looking at and trying to tease out some of the subtleties around this, came across a quote from CIM8, where they talk about the right of the pedestrian. And so what I'm trying to get at here essentially is how long some of the things or some of the elements or some of the ideas that we take for granted perhaps, or that we're still trying to challenge, could take to become embedded within cities. And why I'm linking this in with some of the stuff at the moment is it's quite striking in this current crisis. What's quite striking is the kind of the issue around space in the cities, everyday space on our footpaths, space for pedestrians, public spaces. That also then links in with governance, which I'll come back to a little bit later on. And so the challenges around, and I just saw this morning that in a similar manner to other cities around the world, Dublin City Council are now going to kind of expand into what is normally road space to allow more space for pedestrians in the context of COVID-19. But a lot of this connects in with some of the debates and some of the politics over space that are now kind of firmly embedded within discussions and debates for quite a long period. And in fact, while a lot of these things seem as though they've only emerged in the last 20 years, there's a great quote from 1951 where they talk about the rights of the pedestrian. This is CIM in their summary document. And they say, you know, they talk about how there was a kind of a right of the pedestrian over a prolonged period of time within cities. And they say, today this right of the pedestrian, this human right, has been overridden by the petrol engine. And so the gathering places of the people, the places where the people can meet together without hindrance, have been destroyed. Today, one of our hardest tasks is to reconquest this human right, which is not only in danger, but has in fact been destroyed altogether. And so I quite like the way in which that kind of challenge is still kind of taking place, and that how some of these challenges and some of these kind of political questions kind of come together with some of the questions of today. In terms of the COVID-19 crisis, and again, picking up on what both the previous Catriona and also Alice mentioned as well, is that question of kind of density. And so how do we think about this as a kind of an urban issue? And so I think some of the kind of, there's a real kind of sort of, it's a double-edged sword, if you will. And I really like the way Alice sort of pointed out that, you know, there's a debate emerging in the UK, and I would argue that tentatively that that's emerging here as well, that there's a kind of a tendency to kind of blame density in terms of the spread of COVID-19. And so there's a question here around governance, but also there's this kind of thing that links in with some of the binary discussions around the question of density. And so often density is just kind of the sort of thing of, well, higher density, lower densities, without any actual really kind of nuanced discussion around what density actually is and what we mean when we talk about density. So there's a tendency to kind of, I would argue, sort of reduce it to a question of urban form and the built urban form. And while that is of course important, we also have to think about questions of mobility, social class, and all of these things and how they interconnect together. There's also, to pick up on the work of Roger Cahill, a German-based Canadian researcher and others, when we think about the ways in which this disease is spread, we also have to think about and get away from these reductionist debates about density to look at the more ex-urban or suburban types of spaces. And so they say diseases can spread rapidly between cities through infrastructures of globalization, such as global air travel networks. And so the ex-urban, the suburban become dominant here. Then we also have to start opening questions about, well, who is mobile within these spaces? Why are they mobile? And how the disease spreads in the first place. And so here, when we're talking about density, we have to think about it in terms of the intensity and then also interconnections between different global spaces. But what's really crucial, I think, here to highlight is that these aren't necessarily the kind of high profile global spaces that we think about in everyday life. They're also these spaces that are kind of the back spaces, the back room, if you want, of globalization. These kind of suburban or ex-urban spaces of the airport, for example, these manufacturing spaces, and so on. And so that kind of connectivity on a global scale between cities is really, really important in terms of thinking through this crisis at the moment. As I said earlier on as well, there's a kind of a danger maybe as we emerge from this crisis of the debates taking on this kind of binary, this reductionist kind of binary kind of discussion over density, a kind of a dismissal of the importance of density that have emerged in recent years. There's a danger that that might take hold. And while I would sort of caution against what I would refer to as a fetish of density, there is still a reason and still a significant debate to take place about why we want or why we desire dense cities. And so I would argue that we still want a dense city in terms of the very things that I started off with, such as promoting healthy cities, such as promoting walkability, but all in the context of more open space, more public spaces, and so on. And so that's of crucial importance in terms of how we think on a longer term kind of dynamics of the types of changes that we might want. The second thing about this, I think, and I think this is really highlighted in an Irish context, is the question of governance. And it was really, really interesting to hear both of the previous speakers address this question, albeit in kind of different ways. And so how can we think about this? How can we think about the ways in which cities can actually implement some of these changes? And so again, there's been a sort of a long-term desire for a more compact form of urban growth in the context of Dublin, for example, and that's where most of my research has been based. But I would argue that a lot of what the challenges around this come down to our governance structures. And so we have our 4 local authorities, for example, they do interact, and increasingly through, for example, Smart Dublin, this is becoming quite apparent. But these are relatively weak in comparison to some of the other places that Alice has spoken about. And so there are significant challenges in terms of both the short term, then the medium term, and then also the long term in terms of how we get over these kind of questions. And so when we think about desiring a more kind of balanced form of regional growth, or when we think about actually having coordinated responses to the current crisis, and then also how we might emerge from this, significant challenges start to actually emerge. And so I have no real answers to that. But what I would say is that we can learn from the more kind of general experiences about our urban regional spaces in order to inform us of the challenges that we might see emerge in the coming months, if not the coming years as well. And so I would argue that there's a necessity, not just in terms of kind of the longer term dynamics, but also in terms of how we think about crises such as the current moment. We think about strengthening our governance structures, strengthening our regional governance structures in order to deal with these things when they come along. And I think it's also fair to say, that these kind of questions of risk, and perhaps it's controversial to say that, that compared to, say, for example, Japan that was mentioned by Alice, that we haven't actually had to think about these as much in the context of Dublin or in the context of other cities as well. And so perhaps we could take this as our cue to start thinking through how we actually might connect up various different elements within local governments, how we might actually connect up various different elements in terms of regional governance structures and actually strengthen those structures as well. Okay. Then finally, I think it's really crucial to query questions around inequalities. Okay, so we can see, and I don't think the data in the Irish context is strong enough to show these things emerge kind of to show or to give us a true indication as of yet. But as this thing starts to hopefully to go away, we'll actually start to be able to look at and analyze the data a little bit more carefully. So in the context of New York, it's very, very obvious in the context of other US cities that the already existing disparities in terms of wealth are becoming apparent through this health crisis. And so there's various different questions that start to emerge within the current crisis about essentially who is being impacted by COVID-19 the most. But then also in terms of the debates taking place in Ireland, we start to see questions around mobility. Who's mobile, for example? And so all of this sort of stuff, and this was mentioned by Catriona as well, that what's happening at the moment, you know, what's being highlighted in the crisis is a lot of things that are actually should be apparent in terms of our everyday lives, but remain somewhat hidden beneath the surface. And so these sort of questions of who is mobile, who has a second home, for example. And so again, some of the debates that emerged around that highlight essentially some of the embedded inequalities within the country more generally. Then also what we could pick up on here is kind of the questions of, well, who's hit the hardest in terms of, or where is the expectation in terms of workers? And so we expand here in terms of residential space of who's living where and why into how people are mobile, how they're getting to their workplace, the sort of assumptions around people working from home. Obviously, in terms of care workers, not everyone can work from home. This is also extended into people who are kind of frontline in terms of driving buses, driving other, being engaged in other forms of public transport, being engaged in terms of delivery, all of these different things that places them at a higher risk. And so there's questions here about inequality that are really, really crucial in terms of thinking about urban regional space as well. Also, and again, to pick up on what was talked about earlier on in terms of housing, you know, the housing crisis, again, some of these things have been further highlighted. I'm not sure if people who are watching have seen the piece in the Dublin Inquirer around a warehouse in Glasnevin, but suddenly it was emptied out when the crisis started to hit in. But again, these kind of questions emerge as well. How do we have a warehouse space that has been converted as a residential space? So all of these things become more apparent. But then we start to question, well, where do they go in the current crisis? Suddenly overnight, they're essentially removed from their accommodation. I think it's fair to say as well that the Airbnb issue highlights essentially how a lot of properties within Dublin and other cities were actually being used. And so as we start to emerge from this, I would argue that we need to actually get a hold on what our cities are, who is behind the power dynamics in terms of shaping urban spaces. And so while we can say, well, decisions are made at certain levels of governance, whether it be national or the local level, there's also questions about land ownership, control, these kind of path dependency issues that are crucial for our understanding of the reshaping of cities. And so we might see, as Alice mentioned, a kind of a complete restructuring in terms of the global economy. This will also then mean a restructuring in terms of urban regional space. So where things are made, how they're made, who they're made by, what this means for the forms of, for the type of economy that we see within urban space, these things might be significantly transformed. And so as we start to emerge from the crisis, what I think for me is really crucial to understand is that crises essentially bring about forms of transformation. And whilst, to go back to my quote that I started with, whilst some of these transformations are quite long in terms of particular ideals taking hold, such as the shift away from the dominance of the car, for example, these forms of crisis also essentially are a juncture. And that juncture might mean a very, very different form of urban space. And so if globalization produced the type of urban spaces we're now seeing, the types of kind of sprawling urban spaces or warehouses located on the outer edges, if they produced a dominance of the car, we might see a sort of a shift taking place after this. And there's also an opportunity as well to sort of take these things seriously and to think very carefully from a planning perspective, how we might think through how our goods are produced, how we might think how things get from place to place in terms of storage as well as that. But all of these different things are part and parcel of a form of restructuring that we have yet to get our heads around. And so I'll leave it there, but this is, I think, are kind of the key things for me, is that intersection essentially between what cities are, how the role they play in terms of the transmission of these diseases, questions of governance and how they intersect with questions of inequalities, and how we might bring these three things together essentially to transform our cities. There are going to be external forces that reshape urban space, but the challenge now essentially is to kind of get hold of these things from a governance perspective and shape them in a manner that essentially is equitable and promotes more livable cities for the future. Thanks.